In this video, we'll be talking about scopes in Python. Welcome to another lesson in the Python Programming for Beginners series. If you have any comment or if you want to pass any information across to me, you are free to drop it in the comment section below. I will take it up from there. And while at it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Okay, just like I said, in this video, we'll be talking about scopes. I will talk about categories of scopes. Scopes in Python, which is also applicable to every other programming language. Scope refers to the region where a particular variable is accessible. Understanding scopes is very crucial and essential for effective programming. It helps you to manage your variable names, it helps you to avoid conflicts, and it helps you to understand better how your code works. It helps your code to behave as expected. In Python, we have several categories of scopes. Okay, but before we go right into the categories of scope, let me show you a few examples. Let's say we have a function. You can call the function print name. So let's define a variable inside of the function. We can call name to be John. Alright, so inside of the function, we are going to print name. Alright. Now outside of the function, I'm outside of the function now. Let's invoke the function print name. Okay, and then we can also try to access the variable name. Let's print. We're invoking the print function outside of the function now, and let's try to access the variable name. Okay, if we run that, what do we have? Okay, you can see now at the level at which we invoke the function, name is printed, which is John. But outside of the function, we have a name error, which is name is not defined. Okay, so let's comment this out now and let's observe another example. Let's define a variable. You can call a variable, you can say number. So let's assign number to, you can say 2, let's say number is 2. Okay, so let's define a function to update number. You can call the name of the function update number. Alright, we have our parentheses. Then we can say number is equal to 5. Okay, so we are updating number. Let's print number inside of our function. We have number. Outside of the function, let's call the function so that you can invoke the function, and then can also print number outside of the function. If we run this again, let's clear our console before we run that again. Okay, let's run this. What do we have? So you can see that at the level of invoking the function, number is 5. You can see it there. And outside and after invoking the function, we have number to be equal to 2. I guess the expected behavior, what you are thinking is that number should be 5 at this level, because inside of the function number has been updated. And that leads us to the concept of scoping. Just like I said, scope refers to the region where a variable can be accessed. In our first example here, okay, comment this out. In our first example here, where we print name. So if we delete this line, you can see that name is not defined, but inside of the function, we didn't have that same error. At this time, we do not have the undefined error, but outside of the function, we have an undefined error. That is because name is defined locally, and that leads us to the local scope concept. Local scope refers to a variable which is defined inside of a function, and any variable that is defined inside of a function can only be accessed inside of that function. The variable is local to that function, and you can only access that variable inside of that function. You cannot access that variable outside of the function. From the word local, the variable is localized to that function. You can only access it inside of the function. You can never access it outside of the function. That is local scope. We can make a note here. Let's say local scope. Variable defined inside of a function is localized As per local scope, variable defined inside of the function is localized to that function and can only be accessed inside of that function. Any variable defined inside of a function cannot be accessed outside of that function. That is all about local scope. And after local scope, we have the global scope. You can close our console, you kill the terminal. Global scope refers to variables that are defined at the top level of a module or a script. When I talk about module or script, I'm referring to the file with which you are working in. When we talked about module, we said module is just another name for a file or a chunk of code. Okay, so global scope refers to variables that are defined at the top level. When I mean top level, it does not necessarily mean to be at the number one line of your file. It means that the variable is not inside of any function. So let's get rid of this. For example, now this variable of number to be equal to 2, this variable of number now is a global variable because it is not defined inside of any function or method. It is defined directly inside of the file itself. So this is what we mean by top level. Number now is global scope, not dependent on the line with which it is defined. Either it is defined here or it is defined at the top of the file here. Can as well put it here. So either here or down here, it is still a global variable. It is a global scope because it is defined at the top level of the file or module, whatever you like to call it. So we can note it here. We can say global variable. So global variable refers to variable defined at the top level of your file or module. Okay, so just as we have number to be equal to 5 or number to be equal to 2, number now is a global variable because it is not defined inside of any function. Okay, and global variables, they can be accessed anywhere inside of your file. You can access it at the top level and you can access it inside of any function. Just like we have this update number function here. Number is defined outside of the function, but being that it is a global variable, you can also access it inside of a function. That is the difference between a local and global variable. For global variables, they are accessible anywhere inside of your file, but for local variables, they are only accessible inside of their parent function. Just like we have here, we can access number here just as we print it here, and we can also access number outside of the function. So global variables are accessible inside and outside of the function. They can be accessed anywhere, whereas local variables can only be accessed inside of a function. So if you try to print name now, you are going to have a name error, that this name is undefined. Okay. After global scope, we have the enclosing scope. Let's rename this to be scope and not variable. So we have the enclosing scope as another category of scope. Enclosing scope refers to variables that are defined inside of an outer function. This one is applicable to cases where you have a function defined inside of another function. If you have functions nested inside of another function. So enclosing scope refers to the variables that are defined in the function that is enclosing another function. We can have another example. Let's comment all this out. This is for global. Bring comments, not delete. While this is for local. Okay, so enclosing scope. What I said there, enclosing scope refers to variables defined in the outer function, but can also be accessed from the inner function. For example, we have a function here. We can call this outer. You can call it any name you like. So we have a function now, and inside of the outer function, we have a variable. We can name the variable. Let's name it variable x. Okay. So let's assign 1 to our variable x. And inside of the outer function, we can have another function inside of the outer function. So let's call this inner function. Okay. So inside of the inner function, we can access the variable that is defined out in the outer function. So we can say we want to print x now. If we run this now, normally if x is not accessible from the inner function, you are supposed to run into name error. Assuming you comment this line out now, then you are going to have x to be undefined. So, but because x is accessible from the inner function, then you don't have any name error. So x now is at the enclosing scope. It is in a scope that is enclosing this inner function. If we call this inner function, now let's call it O2. So we need to call the outer function. To call the outer function, we need to go outside of the function. Then you can say outer. Okay, let's run this. What do we have? Okay, so we are calling inner inside of itself. We are supposed to call it in the outer function as one thing about indentation. So we have 1. 1 is printed. You can see that x is accessible from the inner function. So x is in an enclosing scope. Any scope that is in the enclosing scope, it can be accessed from the inner function. And the last type of scope we'll be talking about is the built-in scope. The built-in scope refers to all the variables that are built into Python, just like your print function, your int function, your float, every other function that are built into Python. All those functions are inside of the built-in scope, and they can be accessed anywhere. They can be accessed globally. They can be accessed locally. So you can access all of your built-in functions that are in the built-in scope anywhere in your file. So in cases that you have variables with the same name in the global scope and in the local scope, how does Python resolve which is which? Okay, we can close our terminal now. In case that you have numerous variables with the same name, how do you resolve which is which in any of your scope? Possibly you have a variable defined in the global scope and you have another variable defined in the local scope with the same name. So how does Python resolve which of the variables to be used whenever you call on any of them? So we can clear. Okay, let's comment this out now. I think our file is getting crowded. Okay, so let's say we have a variable with the name of name. Let's say name is John. Okay, as you can see, John is in the global scope now. Okay, let's say we have another function here. Let's say we have a function there. We can call the function, we can just call it my function. Anything, the naming is dependent on you. So you have a function, and inside of the function, you have another variable. Let's call it name also. So we have name to be, let's say, James. Okay. And inside of my function, we can also have another function. Let's call it my function 2. My function 2. Okay. You use underscore, not hyphen. Hyphen is just as if you want to subtract something. And let's call name. Let's say name is can say name is Jane. Okay, just to we have John, we have James, and we have Jane. So inside of my function, we need to invoke my function 2. We have my function 2. We need to invoke that. Okay, we need to invoke my function 2. Then we print name. Let's print name. And in the outer scope, now let's invoke my function. Okay, so if we run this now, what do we have in our console? Okay, so we have Jane printed in our console. Do you wonder that why is it not James, or why is it not John, since we have all the variables bearing the same name? So why are we not having James printed in my function 2, since James is in an enclosing scope, which is also accessible inside of an inner function? So why is James not being printed? Why is it Jane that is printed? And that leads us to the LEGB rule. The LEGB rule describes the order with which Python resolve variables. So we have L as the first scope that is always considered, which is standing for lookup. So whenever Python is interpreting your code, it looks for variables. It first considers the local variable whenever it is executing your code. So just as we have in my function 2 now, we have name in the local scope. So Python is going to give higher priority to the local scope. Then if it can't find the variable in the local scope, it goes to the enclosing scope, which is what E is standing for here. So if it can't find the variable in the enclosing scope, then it goes to the global scope. If it can't find it in the global scope, then it goes to the built-in scope. So that is the priority that Python gives each of the scopes. It first considers the local scope before going to the enclosing, before going to the global, and then finally in the built-in scope. If it can't find your variable in any of the scope, then it gives you an undefined error, a name error. So now that we have Jane in the local scope, so it's going to take name as Jane, because that is what is existing in the local scope. If you comment out name from local scope, so name does not exist in the local scope now, but name is in the enclosing scope. If you run this again now, you are going to see that James will be printed, even though the print function is inside of my function 2 and not inside of my function. So you can see that it is James that is printed, because James is the next in line, which is in the enclosing scope. So if the variable does not exist in the enclosing scope now, then Python is going to look for that. The next line is the global scope. So if we run this again now, you are going to see that John will be printed because John is in the global scope. And if John does not exist in the global scope, now that you are going to have name error, because name is not in local, it's not in enclosing, it's not in global, and it is not in built-in. So you are going to run into name error. If you run this now, you are going to have name error. Okay, so that is the rule that Python follows in executing of your code. It first considers the local scope, then followed by the enclosing scope, followed by the global, and then the built-in. So if your variable is existing in all of this scope, it is going to give the highest priority to the local scope. Ultimately, what determines the scope of a variable is where the variable is defined. If your variable is defined at the top level, your variable is in global scope. If it is defined in a function, it is in local scope. If it is defined in an outer function that is enclosing another function, then your variable is in the enclosing scope. So that's that for this video. Let's talk more about scope in the next lesson. I will see you there.